up, my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer here, coming at you with some new writing advice. Today we're going to do a Lessons from the Masters episode on plot twists and mystery. The focus is going to be on the great Agatha Christie. She is the mother of all plot twists, and I'm so excited to talk about her. Now, if you are writing a mystery, you probably already know a plot twist is kind of a requirement. Agatha Christie is considered one of the best-selling authors of all time. If you haven't heard of her or any of the books she has written, please stop watching this video and go read them right now. She is best known for her 66 detective novels and her 14 short story collections, as well as the world's longest running play, The Mousetrap. The greatest tragedy of her life is that she did not think she was good enough. She is responsible for creating. I say creating, not using, not borrowing, creating several different types of plot twists and tropes in the mystery genre. If you want to read any of her books, I suggest maybe you should go right now because we're going to be talking about all of them. Here are the following classic plot twists that she created. The way too obvious suspect that was really the killer all along. Everyone was guilty. The narrator was guilty. One of the sleuths, including the main detective investigating the mystery, was guilty. The guilty party was impersonating the detective. One of the murder victims was actually guilty. The murders looked like the work of a crazy axe killer, but the murderer was not crazy. The initial victim was a distraction, and the major intended victim was one of those killed later. The murder was just a ploy to accuse someone else and get them arrested. There was no murderer at all. One of the victims was chosen randomly despite the murderer being completely sane. The seemingly accidental victim was in fact the real target, and the seemingly intended victim was the murderer. The murder took place only in the narrator's head. The murderer was a child. Secret circle of secrets are actually the good guys. So as you can see, Agatha Christie, she wrote a lot of books. She was very prolific, and she also created a lot of the current staples in the mystery genre, both in film, video games, graphic novels, short stories, books. Her stuff is still being talked about. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of her examples. We're going to break down how to write a good plot twist, and therefore how to create a good mystery story using Agatha Christie's techniques. So let's take a look. For a great mystery story, you want to make sure that your different clues are hidden in plain sight. The story should not really rely on an elaborate or incredible disguises because that's not very logical. As a reader, it's very frustrating when the answer to everything was really contrived and relied on just this elaborate ruse. And frankly, it's pretty unrealistic. You also want to make sure the character and the motives of the criminal should be pretty normal. Generally, it usually comes down to money or love/lust. The ideal detective story is one where you as the reader or the audience feel like you actually have a fighting chance of figuring out how to solve the mystery yourself alongside the detective that you are following. This is how Agatha Christie kind of rolls. She makes sure that her criminals have very logical motives, and that's part of what's fun to read about them. Next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the person reading your book can go back and see the plot twist or see the answers coming along. You want to hide things in plain sight that maybe the detective himself actually picked up on, but you as the reader felt like it was kind of glossed over. Something that doesn't necessarily happen nowadays, but was very in for Agatha Christie, was the story must not rely upon the occult phenomena. So that's anything supernatural or magical. No. You want to make sure that it stays realistic. Or you also want to make sure that you don't rely heavily on a crazy mad scientist as well. You want to make sure that your characters are real people. Now, your character could be a scientist who's a little bit crazy or be someone who's really into the occult. That's totally fine. But you don't want to necessarily rely on magic intervention, a wizard did it, because that's kind of a cop-out. It's called a Deus Ex Machina, where it's kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, where it's like, well, the reason the plot didn't make any sense was because magic. Nobody likes that. It's generally very frustrating as the audience to have that happen, because you're like, I've been trying to solve this mystery the whole time, and you're just going to throw out some magic. If you're going to have magic or science involved, you want to make sure it's consistent throughout the plot. You don't want to just throw it in there as the solution. Make sure everything makes sense as it comes up, and I'm going to go into that later. You will also want to make sure you don't have a lot of elaborate or bizarre machinery. That's usually irrelevant. That kind of goes with the whole mad scientist and the occult thing. If the answer to your mystery is going to be this elaborate machinery or magic, you want to make sure you build up to that and kind of build the atmosphere around that sort of thing, because otherwise it's going to seem like it came out of left field, and that kind of a plot twist can be very frustrating for the audience. You also want to make sure that your detective is very intelligent, but he's not like superhuman. We should be able to follow his inferences and almost, but not quite, make them with him. And that goes into the psychological method. Hercule Poirot, one of the most famous detectives within the Agatha Christie universe, refers to his little gray cells, his brain, and that's how he ends up figuring out the mysteries. It's not because he has this intense background knowledge of certain things like in Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot are two very different types of detectives. Sherlock Holmes, we are set up to believe that he just kind of knows everything about everything, so when he starts tossing around random knowledge of the different cults in America from 1920, we're just like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Hercule Poirot, on the other hand, focuses more on psychology of people, how people behave. This harkens back to the idea that all a really good detective needs is the facts and a comfortable armchair to solve the case. Hercule Poirot never figures everything out on facts alone. In fact, sometimes it seems like the facts are generally missing from what's happening. Overturned candlestick in the bedroom, the list of toiletries in the bathroom cabinets, etc. aren't necessarily going to tell you what happened. So the different facts aren't necessarily going to tell us who did it. We have to have an understanding of what the motive was. And the Hercule Poirot just has a really, and Agatha Christie by extension, has a really good understanding of the human mind and human psychology. In contrast with other detectives, while Poirot also looks at the facts, he figures out who the murderer is. He can figure out what happened based off of the facts, but he figures out who the murderer is by the nature of the victim and the psychology of the murderer. What makes people do things, what makes them tick. And that's something that I think all writers can take from Agatha Christie and put into their own writing. So you want to make sure that everything is realistic. If you have a mystery, you want to build up to the atmosphere surrounding it. If you're going to include magic or crazy science in your mystery, you want to make sure that it doesn't just come out of left field. You want to build up to it. You want to create a situation and a setting where that makes sense. If you're going to have a mad scientist be the murderer, you should probably give them a science background, right? Maybe it should take place in a lab instead of in a baseball stadium. So you want to make sure that you build on human psychology while you're writing, and that's what makes a really good mystery. What makes a good plot twist is that people can see the little breadcrumbs as they're reading, and then once they find out the plot twist, if it still shocks them, you made them subtle enough, but you want them to be able to go back and see those and they're like, oh, I should have figured that out. If you want a great example and breakdown of Agatha Christie's style of writing, I highly recommend the Doctor Who episode, The Unicorn and the Wasp, which I think I talked about in my story structure video as well. That's where the Doctor and Donna actually meet Agatha Christie, and there's this whole mystery that's around it, and it's just a great episode, and it really breaks down her style of writing and the story structure of different mysteries as well. And of course, it's got that Doctor Who element in it, so when crazy science ends up being the culprit, it actually makes sense because we built up to it. That's all I got for you today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video on plot twists and Agatha Christie and building mysteries. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I post new videos 1 to 2 times a week. If you have a favorite Agatha Christie book or just a favorite mystery book in general that has a really juicy plot twist, please let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for new examples. Thank you so much for watching, and of course, happy writing.